surrounded by it and vulnerable as never before.
Report suspicious activity. Government official 911 for immediate response.
The weather dictates every aspect of our life. Forcing it to change gives man the power of God. The God that lives among us and strives for the new world order.
Hello, I'm Zihan, and welcome back to another episode of Not Just Games. This channel, we've covered many topics on warfare, weapons, and fighting tactics in games, and compared them to reality. We've talked about ground, naval, air, and even space warfare and the conditions in these mediums of war. For example, in ground warfare, building trenches, having the high ground like a hill, are ways to gain advantage using geographical features. Nevertheless, regardless of the medium, one thing remains constant in these wars. Do you know what it is? Well, if you read the title, you'd know that the answer is weather. Weather is the natural phenomenon of the atmospheric condition, typically the daily or weekly precipitation and temperature. For example, it's raining or snowing, it's hot or cold, and the air is moist or dry. Climate, however, is used to describe the long-term weather conditions in a certain area, averaging the weather conditions over an extended period of time, usually 30 years. For example, while we may describe the weather of a sandy desert using the words sunny, cloudy, windy, hot and cold, we might describe a desert climate as arid, as it receives very little rainfall. Weather like rain, fog, and clear skies could drastically change fighting conditions, such as visibility, comfort, and energy expenditure of combatants. Before going any further, do drop a like and smash the subscribe button if you'd like to learn more from games. I'm sure many of you would be interested in this topic, just like the other warfare topics we've covered so far. Now, weather modification is the altering of weather using artificial means, the most popular of which is cloud seeding, which I will explain in detail later on. While not many warfare games cover the use and effects of weather warfare, there are many games depicting the harsh and cruel effects weather and climate have on humans. Aurora Weather Warfare is a survival game planned to be released this year. While no gameplay clips have been released yet, there are several pictures and some text relating to its story on its Steam page. To be concise, in the world of Aurora, climate change artificially induced by rich and powerful individuals has forced people to struggle for survival. Heavy rains, floods, snow, and forest fires drive people out of their homes and out into the world. The player will play as a father and husband protecting his family, trying to make sure they survive the unforgiving weather. I think it might turn out something similar to The Last of Us, where the dire situation forces you to be inhumane to others, so that you can save your family. Some other titles, such as The Long Dark and Don't Starve Together, also explore the difficulties faced by people braving harsh weather conditions to survive. In The Long Dark, the protagonist survived a plane crash in the winter. To survive, he had to collect wood to make a fire, make a filter to purify melted ice into drinking water, and hunt animals for food. In Don't Starve Together, a co-op survival game, you, and hopefully your friends, have the opportunity to experience the merciless treatment from all 4 seasons. The game will start in spring, the gentlest and calm season for you to prepare the materials, food, and tools needed to last a year. Then comes summer, when the sun would scorch the earth and the wildfires may burn your crops. Autumn, when the rains bring frogs to terrorize your tent. And finally winter, when you might starve to death if you did not prepare enough food. Sure enough, none of the games above is directly related to warfare, but it gives us a better picture of what devastation can bad weather bring upon mankind. We've also talked about the conditions and tactics in warfare before this, which you can revisit if you're interested. Links in the description below. In this video, I will talk about, first, the effects of weather on war. Second, how is weather warfare carried out? Third, restrictions on weather warfare. As I have briefly explained, weather can impact the outcome of a battle because it affects the conditions of the combatants, vehicles, and equipment. In fact, there were a handful of battles that were greatly affected by weather. For those of you who have watched our UAV video, if you haven't, the link's in the description below, do check it out. But for those who did, you might remember how the Austrians tried to drop time-fused incendiary balloon bombs on the city of Vannes, and the wind blew the balloons back to the Austrians, and the attack was rendered ineffective. The Venetians still surrendered later due to fatigue and starvation from the Austrians' blockage of supplies like food and medicine. But in a way, we can say the weather has spared the city of Vannes from the Austrians' bombing. There are a few ways weather can impact the outcome of a war, by affecting the combatant's condition, visibility, and natural phenomena, to name a few. First, let's talk about weather's impact on combatant's condition. Have you ever craved for ice cream on a hot day, or shiver on a cold day? Weather can affect our body physiology, the way our body works, because our body has to adapt to the surrounding temperature. When the atmosphere temperature is high, the human body uses sweat evaporation to cool down. As a result, we lose more water and become dehydrated and thirsty. Conversely, when it's sweatier weather, our bodies shiver to produce heat, raising our body core temperature. Other than merely adapting to short-term change in temperatures, our bodies will also adapt to the local climate we live in, given enough time. This process is known as acclimation, where living organisms adapt to the characteristics of a climate, such as temperature, pH, and oxygen levels to conserve energy. In terms of temperatures, take the example of this study, where the responses to cold temperature of Australian Aborigines and unacclimatized Caucasians are recorded and compared. In this study, when exposed to cold temperatures lower than 5 degrees Celsius, Aborigines have a more constant metabolism rate when compared with the unacclimatized Caucasians. This means that the Aborigines' body functions are more stable when exposed to cold because they have adapted to that environment. Humidity is another factor affecting the combatant's health and performance. Imagine the air like a sponge, which may be dry or wet. When the air is dry or low in humidity, it's easier for our sweat to evaporate, and it is readily absorbing water vapor. However, when the humidity is high, our sweat cannot evaporate because the air is saturated with water vapor. As mentioned earlier, our main cooling mechanism is sweating, and when we can't sweat, we can't release heat efficiently, and our body will work harder to create more sweat, even though the sweat produced will not readily evaporate. This will create a vicious cycle where we produce too much sweat, but our body temperature remains high. This will eventually cause dehydration and hypothermia, which may cause exhaustion and fainting. All these problems, compounded with the fact that combatants are in a constant state of alert because they are in a warfare, will cause enormous mental stress on their minds. This pressure would further strain the body's energy and resources to cope with the conditions on the ever-changing battlefield. For example, Napoleon invaded Russia in June 1812 to break up the trade relations between Russia and the UK. The Russians employed the scorched earth tactic, burning down lost cities and surrounding lands as they retreated to prevent the French from gaining any resources like food and clothing. In the end, the French army, faced with cold and starvation, were forced to retreat by November. Out of the 700,000 men who marched into Russia, only 27,000 returned to France. Similarly, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion on Russia, failed because of weather and overconfidence. Adolf Hitler began the invasion of Russia in June 1942 and planned to end the operation by autumn 1942. The movement into Russian territory was rapid. By the time they reached Moscow, it was early December and it was freezing. Just like Napoleon before him, Hitler had underestimated the long and cold winters of Russia. Without the proper supply chains, rations, and clothing, The Germans were repeatedly repelled by Russian forces in Moscow. Eventually, Moscow held the ground, and Nazi Germany was defeated. Secondly, let's talk about weather's impact on visibility. One of the great examples of the use of weather as a cover was Washington's retreat from Long Island. During the American Revolution, in the Battle of Brooklyn, 1776, George Washington went against British Admiral Richard Howe around Long Island. General Washington had 20,000 men spread across Long Island, but they were unable to withstand the 32,000-man strong British army. On 27th of August, Admiral Howe had the opportunity to strike the American rear. However, Admiral Howe ordered the Brits to stop fighting and dig trenches to surround the Americans and prepare for a final onslaught. Coincidentally, there was a storm in the area. While the British troops were digging trenches for 2 days, the Americans quickly took advantage of the weather. Under the cover of darkness, rain, and fog, the Americans crossed the Easy River to Manhattan. By 29th August, some British soldiers noticed no sign of American activity and they searched the area. At the same time, George Washington, the last man remaining, went aboard the last boat, and all the remaining American troops were all able to safely evacuate. This gave them a chance to regroup and rebuild their morale, eventually winning the war at Yorktown in 1781. Fog reduces visibility and may benefit or debilitate a troop depending on their position. Finally, let's examine weather's impact on geography. Well, weather is an atmospheric phenomenon, meaning it's the activity in the air. It may cause other natural phenomena such as drought, flood, landslides, and wildfire. Landslides and muddy roads may make transportation harder, cutting off land supply lines. A wildfire may cause a scorched earth effect, rendering an army stranded in an area without supplies. So, how is weather warfare carried out? Before that, we must ask, why would a military force engage in weather warfare? From what we have discussed just now, there are many ways weather can impact the battlefield and change the tide of war. The ability to manipulate weather conditions is very powerful, as you can create an ideal situation that favors your army. For example, if you are surrounded by enemies, you can summon out a blizzard or a fog between you and them, covering your retreat. If you can set up long ranges in the enemy territory, turning their soil muddy and their soldiers cold and weak, you can cut off their supply road and reduce enemy morale. Extended periods of rain or cold may even affect the flora and fauna in the region. For example, declining crops yield will cause economic losses and, in worse times, famine. Applying that to smaller nations with no capability to reverse this weather engineering will create a political and economic chokehold on them. Hypothetically, one would artificially create hunger and poverty in a nation to induce uprising and riot. As mentioned at the start of this video, cloud seeding is the most common method of weather modification. Precipitation such as rainfall, snow, and hail are a result of gravity's pull onto clouds that are heavy enough. Cloud seeding works by dispersing substances such as silver iodide or dry ice particles into clouds to promote condensation. This, in turn, makes heavier clouds and finally leads to precipitation. In many cases where there is a lack of precipitation, cloud seeding would be carried out to induce precipitation. This method has been used to counter undesirable natural phenomena such as forest fires and haze. Two main methods of cloud seeding are: first, using huge cannons to shoot the particles into the sky. Second, using airplanes to drop the particles into clouds. The most prominent and most documented use of weather warfare would be Operation Popeye, where the United States Air Force carried out cloud seeding to extend the monsoon season over certain areas in Vietnam and Laos during the Vietnam War. The roots of this operation lied in Project Storm Fury, run by the US government from 1962 to 1983. Project Storm Fury aimed to reduce the ferocity of storms and hurricanes by lacing them with silver iodide to induce freezing, breaking up their structure. Later, however, it was discovered that hurricanes do not contain enough supercooled water for this method to be successful. Over the years, most of Storm Fury's seeding did not yield positive results, and it was finally ended in the middle of 1983. Nevertheless, they have inspired the US Army during the Vietnam War to employ cloud seeding to manipulate weather for strategic advantage. Their target, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a network of roads that were used by the Viet Cong to transport personnel and material. The roads run all the way from North Vietnam, South Vietnam, to Laos and Cambodia. It is the lifeline of Vietnamese soldiers fighting at the South Front, supplying them with rations, medicine, weapons, and other equipment from up north. In 1959, North Vietnam instituted the 559th Transportation Group, tasked to maintain and upgrade the logistic and communication lines to supply the Viet Cong uprising. As a result, the trail is a very intricately designed transportation system consisting of roads, tunnels, and bases. The Vietnamese even built a 5,000-kilometer fuel pipeline along the trail to supply petrol. Some sections of said pipeline were still in use in the 1990s. All these factors made the trail a crucial target for the US military. Severing the Viet Cong supply lines would give the US a huge advantage as their opponents will be lacking in food and ammunition. The USAF 54th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron was tasked with the job to increase rainfall beginning on 20th March 1967. They had several goals to achieve, namely, first, to soften road surfaces and make traversing the muddy roads more difficult. Second, causing landslides along roads to block off vehicles. And third, washout or flood river crossings. Their operation areas included parts of Laos, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam, focusing on Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation was highly successful in terms of prolonging the rainy season and creating muddy roads. Over 80% of the seeding attempts were successful and are speculated to have increased total rainfall by 30 to 50%. Initially, this was a top-secret operation approved by President Nixon. However, a story on Operation Popeye appeared to the public eye first in March 1971, published by reporter Jack Anderson. More than a year later, on July 3, 1973, New York Times also published an article on this project. 2 days after that, the operation was cancelled by the US government, fearing public backlash. Up till here, you might ask, is weather warfare restricted now? Well, just like how weapons used in wars are regulated, usually by the United Nations, to minimize unnecessary suffering in war, the use of weather modification in warfare is prohibited by an international treaty called the Environmental Modification Convention, or ENMOD. In 1974, under public pressure, both houses of the US Congress rushed to pass laws that would ban weather manipulation for the purpose of war. Later on, US and USSR held bilateral discussions and drafted this convention before it was passed in the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 10, 1976. With that, come my final thoughts. In this video, we've learned that weather can play a crucial part on the battlefield. Today's weather modification technology is mostly used for the benefit of mankind, such as dousing out forest fires and clearing up haze. However, weather modification used for malicious or hostile purposes can have terrible effects on people. To some, weather modification is the next step in scientific progress, as we can use our knowledge and technology to further shape our world. Using weather modification to overcome undesirable phenomena can definitely be beneficial to us. The ability to prevent or handle disasters like floods and droughts is literally a lifesaver. However, others may think that weather modification is playing God. We might not fully understand the effects it has on the ecosystem, as they might be too complex to be analyzed accurately. In any case, I personally believe that weather modification has a wide and long-standing impact on the environment. As such, careful, extensive experiments and simulations must be conducted before the real deal is released on the field. While the UN has banned the use of weather modification in war, countries that adopted extreme ideologies, broke treaties, and waged war unlawfully were not unheard of. As such, experimenting ways to counter or mitigate weather warfare will be a major priority when that time comes. What do you think? Do you think weather modification is good or even a necessity? Or do you think the risk of weather warfare is unmanageable? let us know in the comments down below. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, like and share our video. Stay safe and see you in the next episode.